Excellent. Well, hello. I'm Matthew Lee of Inner City Press, here from inside the United Nations, and going to be speaking with Eli Lake, a national security reporter for the New York Sun. Eli, thanks a lot for agreeing to be on.
Thank you for having me, and I'm speaking to you from Washington D.C. on a day I'd like to thank Willis Haviland Carrier for inventing the air conditioner.
All right.
Anyway, because it's hot.
Definitely.
It's hot.
I second that. So, without going out of our ways to find points of disagreement, I think we've agreed that Sudan may be. There are many possible things. I know that you were there in 2002, so maybe you can say, and I'll jump in as needed.
Well, I'll try to keep this brief because you recently returned from a trip out to Darfur. I was there before the UN, rather before the Darfur crisis, and it was the sort of first serious diplomacy. I was with Senator Danforth, who was the U.S. envoy, to try to sort of come up with an agreement, which they eventually did between the SPLA. That's the Sudanese People's Liberation Army, and led by the late John Garang, and the government of Omar Bashir, the Islamic supremacists in charge of Khartoum. My impressions at the time was that very little could come of a long-term relationship with this regime. But it was obvious that they were freaked out after 9/11, and they had been clearly cooperating with the U.S. on against Al Qaeda. They turned over the records of their intelligence records on Al Qaeda, and I guess there was some good that came of that. Though I understand recently the cooperation has been less was not as helpful. But the other thing I would say is that when I met with I got an interview with the late John Garang, and you saw child soldiers around, and his troops when we went to the Nuba Mountains. I got a chance to sort of jump over with Senator Danforth and the delegation a freshly slain bull as part of a ritual. And you could tell that these tribesmen were going to eat protein or animal protein for the first time in maybe months. And so as they were kind of coming in towards it, like the SPLA soldiers started beating their feet like they were dogs. And obviously the SPLA was on the much better side than the government, whose tactics were atrocious. They dropped iron bombs on people as they were trying to get sort of relief and so forth. But at the same time, seeing that, you realize that it's that actors in African wars are never totally morally pure.
That's really well. I'll just plus ça change. I mean, in the Darfur conflict, I think there are many people here that I mean, obviously what the Sudanese government has done is unconscionable. I mean, the more recent there's more recent evidence where even the rebel groups themselves, one, they attacked a peacekeeper camp at Haskanita and killed 10 of them. And then more recently, there's this. Not that there was anything necessarily. GEM, the Justice and Equality Movement, tried to assault Khartoum. They got to within like 5 kilometers. I mean, I went out and saw the square they were stopped in, and I mean, so it actually. But in the course of that, it's pretty clear that they used child soldiers. Some of whom not just that they were children. They were physically taken from these camps in eastern Chad and made to fight. So that's. I think one of the and I wonder maybe in the North-South conflict, were there? I mean, they reached that CPA, and supposedly now they're on track to having a referendum and I guess voting to break away if they so choose. But were there people then? Was it as sort of a black and white thing where they would say Khartoum is terrible and South Sudan are an army of liberation, freedom fighters? There
was certainly a perception among people who were boosters of the SPLA in the United States that the SPLA were freedom fighters, and they in many ways they were freedom fighters. But first of all, their tactics in isolation were not something that most people who aren't familiar with these kinds of wars would agree with. And secondly, Garang was. I mean, Garang's a fascinating guy, by the way. I mean, He told me he had studied at Grinnell and had a fondness for the Big Ten, which was in like, what I'm saying, like
sure.
in his Rumbeck military base with like 14-year-olds with enormous, machine guns. Right, and I'm like, and you never know what a liberal arts education is going to do for you. And I'm like, okay. Sure. I went to a liberal arts school myself, so. So, but so he had an ability to talk to Westerners in a language that they understood. But I think it was also clear that the SPLA was the sort of militia that ran things, and it's not something that we in the Western world, in advanced Western democracies, would say even approaches how they organize the areas under their control. Mm-hmm. Didn't have anything approaching the rule of law. Didn't have anything that would approach any of the sort of negative freedoms that or positive, that we care about. It was like they controlled people because they controlled the sacks of rice and so forth that they would get.
This is maybe this is going down a bad road, but sort of. It seems to me that at this remove of some years, mm-hmm. how much of the interest in the U.S. in the North-South conflict in Sudan had to do with the kind of the religious element, the idea that it's a fundamentalist Islamic central government oppressing Christians and animists in the South? Well,
that's the other thing, though, is that there was a big part of that, but that was also very true. Right. There was. It's disgusting. The Sudanese regime is horrible, and this is kind of maybe getting into another topic of mine. But I don't even understand why they should be kicked out of the UN. They took the oldest Anglican church in Sudan, mm-hmm. okay, and there are Christians in Sudan. There are quite a few of them actually, mm-hmm. and they turned it into almost like this propagandistic history of Arab conquering the uncivilized. It was a complete. Sort of whitewash job, but they made sure to put it on the site of this very holy site. Mm-hmm. There was, we went to a church where, people told us these firsthand stories of on Easter Sunday, having militias affiliated with the government. It's kind of how the Sudanese do things, is that they have one step removed, but everybody knows that they allow it. Everybody knows that they even probably encourage it in some ways, and a lot of people have two hats, similar to, by the way, the Jim Crow South, where the sheriff, by day was the sheriff, and at night he was the Klansman. Mm-hmm. Similar kind of thing we can say goes on in Sudan, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. Mm-hmm. So, and the whole approach to their, school curricula, everything that they do is what I would call an Islamic supremacist agenda. So that was simultaneously true, even if the Christians who were fighting for their survival in many cases and fighting for their rights, or animists fighting for their rights, were not the kind of morally pure actors that we would like them to be if we were to sort of novelize the actual war.
Do you think? One thing that, as you were saying that came to mind to me is this is something that the Serbs say this. The Serbs say that the Kosovar Albanians are desecrating their churches. Do you think that that's? I don't even know why I'm asking this as a question, except to say I think that people. I think that a lot of the people that I know here are very dismissive of that and say it's sort of it's too anecdotal. I guess you were there, so you think that there was really an attempt to wipe out the religion in South Sudan?
Well, put it like this: I met a man who didn't have hands mm-hmm. because he basically tried to pick up an exploding grenade that was thrown into a packed church service. Mm-hmm. Now, maybe he'd lost his hands another way.
Right.
But I believed him. The other thing is that my experience with Sudanese diplomats is that they constantly lie. Right. And that they're just pathological liars. Up to the foreign minister. The foreign minister at the time, I remember was asking the CIA came here in 2000 and, mm-hmm. How'd that go? He said, I went on national television and I said to all of the people of Sudan, because they have nothing to fear, we have new guests. They're from the Central Intelligence Agency. Please treat them with the utmost respect. Right. So I thought that was telling, I don't know. They're scumbags, and I'd like to seize all their assets and give them to nonviolent resistance movements. How about that?
Right. No. But here's the thing, and I honestly think that many people involved in the Save Darfur movement. I talked to somebody last night who said to me, "Wait a second. You mean the people in Darfur aren't Christians?" I honestly think
they're Muslims. Yeah,
absolutely. But that's some part of the this is some part of the world's interest in the Darfur conflict sort of came organically out of the interest in the North-South one, and that it's obviously it's not a religious war between Khartoum and Darfur, right? It's or maybe it's even calling it a war you wouldn't agree with, but there's not a religious element. Both sides are Muslims.
Well. Yes, both sides are Muslims, but it's also, I think, but you can argue that it's at the least ethnic cleansing. The
sure.
State Department has called it a genocide. Other people have called it genocide as well. If you, I guess the genos in the sense would be the Darfuri people. And by the way, what they did in Darfur and what the government sanctioned, what the government provided air cover for God's sakes, we know now. is unconscionable.
Right.
And it ought to be there. I mean, I just saying that there ought to be some test that where you sort of lose at least some degrees of sovereign equality and sovereign respect. And I know that as a concept that might work, in a newspaper column or a university seminar, and it's very hard to. And that's, I mean, but before we get into that, because that's a good conversation, I feel like you were just there. So what's your assessment on the ground? Like, I'd really like to hear that. What do you do at this point?
Sure. No, I mean, I guess it's, for some reason, since I'm here, I wouldn't presume that a speed trip through, we went to South Sudan as well, but we flew out to Darfur with the Security Council ambassadors. Mm-hmm. Without question, we went to sort of the safest part of the three provinces. We went to the capital of North Darfur, El Fasher, which is like the UN peacekeeping mission's headquarters, and we went to see a camp, and there's clearly like. There are guns everywhere. People are frightened. Many people that we spoke to said, had held up pictures of helicopter gunships dropping bombs. I mean, I think there are portions of Darfur that are not really under government control, right? I think that South Darfur and West Darfur are largely controlled by rebels. So there's probably a lot more fighting there.
Yeah.
But I will say this, and and not just to try to engage and disagree with you. I think that the dynamic, at least as to Darfur, the dynamic between Sudan and Chad, basically at war and like funding each other's rebels, is a big part of the issue. I mean, I think that not that it lets Sudan off the hook for killing civilians, but when they say like they're fighting a war with their neighbor, they are. Now that doesn't mean in war you can kill civilians, but it does. I think that. What bothered me about this trip of the Security Council is that the ambassadors were kind of grandstanding about we're standing up to Sudan. They held a press conference for the traveling press before they met with Bashir. They came out afterwards and said, we really stuck it to him. And then we went to Chad next door, which has funded rebels and which is not treating its people very well. Political opponents have disappeared, and there was zero pressure put on the government. And the only difference that I see, not the only difference, there's a difference in number of killed by the two governments.
And the Sudanese started it too, so that's part of it too.
Right. I think, but honestly, and you can disagree. To me, a big explanation is in terms of the way the UN works and the Security Council works. Chad has a strong supporter in France. France was the colonial power and will not, and the Security Council entirely defers to France to write resolutions on Chad. Everything about Chad is they let France do it. And nobody says, everyone criticizes China, for example, and I do too, but, China's the defender of Sudan, China will veto resolutions, and they have vetoed, although they've, whether because of the Olympics or not, they've actually, on this trip at least, you didn't see their fingerprints anywhere. They let people mouth off, they didn't seek to lead the leg of the trip to Sudan. France's role with Chad is much more sort of excusing the inexcusable. But I don't want to equate the two.
You know what I like? I like it because because frankly, we need to see the whole picture, right? And there is a narrative on Sudan, and even if that narrative is sort of generally correct, it's the details matter, and I think it's important to point that out. Chad is not a nice place either, but and I guess I suppose in some sense you could say the Darfuri rebels in Sudan. At least what we know about what was like in those internally displaced people's camps, the IDP camps. We know that in some ways those guns that were brought to them were for their self-defense, given the agenda that has been made very clear by the Sudanese-supported Janjaweed. And I would just on China. I would goes a little bit further, if I may, because China's I think has a majority stake in the Greater Nile Oil Petroleum Company. They built the pipeline in Sudan, and when they built the pipeline, we have evidence, satellite photo evidence. They destroyed villages to do so, and I just sort of feel like what's interesting to me I'm an American nationalist. I'm happy to say. Sure. Coming up on our national holiday, that it's quite popular to sort of bash Bush as an imperialist and so forth, right? But no one ever gets on China for their imperial activities. I mean, it's sort of what the Chinese are doing is akin, I think, what they did in building that pipeline, what they've done in terms of supporting Sudan. It's not quite like the Belgians in the Congo, but it's pretty bad.
No, yeah, speaking of which, they just signed this $9 billion resources deal with the formerly Belgian Congo. So, I mean, from their point of view, it's slightly...
But why does anyone ever talk about Chinese
Oh,
imperialism?
but I think people do. I mean...
Who talks about Chinese imperialism? I mean, I talk about the people who make the puppets. You know what I'm talking about? With the drum circles.
Right.
You know, those people who are always disrupting General Petraeus hearings in Congress.
No, but I think within the sort of the U.S. I mean, I'm bombarded by emails from human rights NGOs saying China, stick it to China, boycott the
human rights
Olympics.
NGOs, though, they're like professionals who actually
Maybe I'll forward them along to you. Maybe you should forward me your mail, and I'll forward you my mail, and then we'll and really, you'll have something that you want, and I'll have what I want. But, I think
that's great.
No, but the one thing, I mean, I'm just trying to think this through on China because actually I was.
Is it because like China is sort of like kind of commie?
Okay,
is that it?
Right. No. I'm thinking of something that you might disagree. Tell me what you think of this. I was thinking of this the other day. I went to an event yesterday of the UN's guy on drugs and crime. His name is Antonio Maria Costa. But he has this whole presentation how heroin is back because of the Taliban and the FARC areas of Colombia. They're all making money off drugs. This is all true, but it certainly is a very popular analysis in Washington. It seems to me he's basically saying these rebel groups or insurgent groups or terrorists that we don't like are the cause of the drug problem too. So if you just knock them out, you knock off drugs. But what's interesting is the UN matters. The ambassador or somebody from the Colombian mission steps up and says, we totally disagree with your analysis. Like, that's the sort of, it's interesting. Rather than the press, you have like the country saying, screw you, and just stick to the numbers. But it suddenly made me think, like, why Colombia is never brought up in the UN, right? It's been, admittedly it's a civil war, but it's been a pretty vicious war for like 2 decades, right?
No, it seems to be, the Colombian government's doing so much better now than it was 10 years ago.
No, but it's more...
Colombia's been fantastic.
It's more, but let's turn it back slightly and sort of like, government, just like you were saying. I think we can say that paramilitaries in Colombia were doing the bidding of the government and did kill civilians, right? I think that happened.
Yes, that's true.
But so why? It's a
on the government side, but then there were also
absolutely. The FARC
drug fueled. They did bad stuff too.
Right. No, I'm not equating. More, it was my question was the U.S. I don't know. It's certainly at Colombia's request. Why did that conflict, not just in the last 2 years, in the last 10 years, never get on the Security Council agenda? Why is it never brought up at the UN? And tell me if I'm wrong. I think it's because the U.S. says this is our continent or double continent. North and South America, we don't need the UN. We'll handle it. We have the OAS.
Well, there is the OAS, which.
Right. Well, there's ASEAN too. I guess
as far as regional,
where I'm going with this is, although I'm not a fan of China, and I think what happened in Myanmar is terrible, and North Korea, etc. In a way, if I step back and look at it kind of structurally, I say, okay, the U.S. says the Americas are ours, and whatever happens, whether it was the funding of the Contra, I don't want to go back too far, but this is our area, our sphere of influence. Keep the UN out. Well, that's China's approach to Asia, and we don't like it, and the people they're defending are horrible, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, but Sudan isn't in Asia. It's
No. Exactly. No. I was. Since you mentioned China, I was thinking of China.
No. I mean Myanmar, or I like to call it Burma, by the way.
Okay.
I don't want to give that point to any credit.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. No, but listen. That's a good point. My point here is that it's fashionable now to be anti-American. But in fact, if you look at the other great powers, they're far worse. Right. And at least I've always done this kind of calculation. I don't think you're going to have a world without a superpower. And the best of the alternatives that are realistic at this point is the United States of America, because I think we are a fairly benign hegemony, at least by historical standards. We tend to care about things like elections eventually and rule of law. And while the record is not perfect, and I'm not here to defend everything that the United States has ever done, if you compare that to like what motivates the sort of actions and diplomacy of Russia or China, I don't think it's comparison.
I think I'll say. I'm going to open a huge can of worms in a moment, but I want to ask you one thing first. Let me keep the can of worms on the side.
All right.
But and it's a can that I try not to open, but it has to. We're getting there. But I want, in terms of just on Darfur, I wanted to get your view of this. It turns out, and I sort of stumbled on this and I looked into it, and it was there when I saw it, which is that the biggest contract, the UN, when they set up this peacekeeping mission in Darfur that's still radically understaffed, but they're spending money. There's money being spent. And in fact, the biggest chunk of the money, $250 million, was given to U.S.-based Lockheed Martin to run the peacekeeping camps in Darfur.
Fascinating.
No bid contract, by the way. The U.S. State Department had been funding these camps for the Amos peacekeepers, right, the African Union.
Right.
And then they wrote, and I got a leaked copy of a letter from Condi Rice to the UN saying, you should take over this contract. And then the UN, within the UN, they said, well, it's going to be, if we put it out to bid, it's going to be a lot of disruption. We just need to do this on a sole source basis. Now, what's interesting to me is that for all the complaints about UN corruption, this is the biggest dollar value corruption I've seen since I'm here. I know that oil for food was bigger, but I didn't see it. This I've seen, and in fact, the company got it with no. It's totally unclear how the number was chosen out. Once you go off the grid of competition, how much do you know how much you're paying? But why? I guess my thing is I think that it's. And I know that the UN, for example, Rich Williamson, the U.S.'s envoy to Sudan, went to Sudan earlier this month, and one of the items that he raised was that the Sudanese government should give another extension for the Lockheed Martin contract.
Well, now, can I just ask a couple questions about it?
Definitely.
What made the UN oil for food scandal a matter of corruption is because there's reams of evidence that the companies that were hired to ultimately, I guess, make sure that Iraqis received food and medicine were colluded at a local level, at least, with the Saddam regime to have rotten food and spoiled medicine. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that they also didn't do a very good job of checking other things that were supposed to be going into Iraq, which was sort of their main job. And then finally, the BNP Paribas in bank in Paris was letting Saddam use those oil vouchers to bribe very high officials, including Charles Pasqua in France, but also major Russian politicians and other people who may have influence on that Security Council. So like all these things, there's a little bit more than just a sole source contract. And if it turns out that Lockheed Martin, I know that Blackwater had put in a bid at one point to try to bring peace to some of these refugee camps, or to sort of pull this off. So if Lockheed Martin actually does the job and lives are saved as a result of it, then I don't really care.
To be clear, one, they're not providing any security in refugee camps. This is to
what is it
build
for
and
again?
maintain the peacekeepers camps.
So build and maintain the peacekeepers
contract.
All right, well, I guess on a lesser scale, then it's the same thing. Like if the camp works for the peacekeepers and
number one, I was
it's
there
not made with shoddy materials. But you may know it's maybe a big scam.
No, here's the thing. As it turns out, first of all, how do you choose the price? It turns out that Lockheed Martin threatened to stop serving food in the camps unless they got an extension of their food contract, and they got a $25 million contract. And literally the documents in the UN show if we don't agree to this, even though the number's too high, there'll be no food tomorrow. Turns out that the same Lockheed subsidiary is called Pacific Architects and Engineers, PA&E, has the UN's airfield contract in the Congo.
The Vietnam era.
Yeah, for Manuk. They have this. They have a contract there.
They've had that for years, though. They were monitoring stuff like in this north-south conflict.
Sure, no, exactly. And people say, well, they're very qualified. The thing is that the UN itself knows that they were overcharged by PA&E in the Congo for airfield services. For example, for an airfield, not even in a major city in the Congo, where maybe 2 flights a week late, PA&E was charging the UN for like 2 fire trucks on constant call and 18 staff members. They were never even there.
Dude, you're like Encyclopedia Brown on this.
No, on this because I really spent a lot of time checking it out.
It's good. No, I don't know any of this. This is amazing. Yeah.
Right. No, and I guess, but because to me the reason it really grabbed me is because it's kind of UN corruption is kind of like what is it? Dog bites man.
Yeah.
And the UN and Tom Coburn, whatever. You have a number of senators that will put out a press release and say it's unconscionable, what a waste of money, the Durban II conference. But here's one where the company benefiting is a U.S. company, and there's all kinds of paperwork. It's almost like I don't want to say that it's a little bit counterintuitive. It's kind of like the U.S. misusing the UN, right? I don't know.
Yeah.
That's
listen. If I wanted to be cynical. First of all, I think you're onto something. What you've told me about, it's ridiculous. They're saying they can't, they're not going to serve food to the AU peacekeepers. Like, what is that?
It was a total shakedown.
It's a total shakedown, absolutely. So I'm like, I kind of, from what you've told me, I'm agreeing with it at this point. But I would just add on this that, the U.S. does
give a lot of money,
contribute not just money. Like all the logistical lift capabilities and so forth. The U.S. it really makes the UN work.
Right.
Because, the U.S. has a global presence. It's got the Navy. It's got the Air Force to sort of really make a lot of these things happen. So, in that respect, it's sort of, but yeah, no, interesting. That's things I did not know.
But also here's the question. Not to be, again, you were saying I guess if it's popular to be anti-U.S., then today let me play to the crowd because.
Yeah.
I mean, not on this topic.
Do you think Blogging Heads viewers? I don't think Blogging Heads viewers, by the way, are like particular. I think
right. No, I know. I'm joking, and I'm not. I'm actually on many issues. I mean, I find myself here usually defending the U.S. Well, people will say, it's. And that, I'll get to that can of worms in a second. But this issue of the missing helicopters in Darfur that they can't deploy because they just don't have the air assets. Why hasn't the U.S. just either provided them or provided the resources to an African country that's an ally of it to give it? They haven't done it.
Because we're trying to defeat Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Afghanistan?
Okay.
How about that?
No, absolutely.
No, because the military is stretched fairly thin right now. I mean, but yes, no, we need more helicopters.
Yeah, but I mean, we fund, like, for example, we give a lot of weapons to Ethiopia. Is that true? I mean, I think it's true.
I think so.
You're
sure.
The guy, right?
I mean, I know that the special forces worked with the Ethiopians when they went into Somalia on Christmas Day. 2006. Sure. And I also know that the Islamic Courts Union at least has many people in its leadership who are hardened Al Qaeda terrorists. So
I think actually we may have found another bone of contention because I get, and again, it's all the how smart. I guess nobody else wanted to do it, but to overthrow the Islamic Courts Union, right?
Yes.
To use Ethiopia, which is a historic enemy of Somalia, right? Which many people in Somalia are unhappy with the occupation, don't like Al Qaeda either. But it seems like this was, and it was an invasion of one country by another, right? I mean, just legally speaking, Ethiopia drove on the capital and took over the country.
Legally speaking, Somalia is not much of a country, but
okay, yes. Right, no, exactly. Yes. So it was actually every day during that time frame there was called by Qatar, then on the Security Council. Right. There was an emergency meeting of the Security Council. But they never passed anything. One, because the U.S. would have vetoed it. But most of the countries were like, screw it, screw these Islamic courts. As you probably know, from the point of view of the Islamic courts, they said the country sucked for 14 years. They actually brought some stability to the region they control, right?
Now, well, I don't look at it that way. I think what the Islamic Courts Union did is what Al-Qaeda usually does is which they go to areas which are you've failed in failing states, and they went in and then they basically killed anybody who would be any kind of opposition to them, and they started to try to impose a very ascetic version of Sharia in Mogadishu. It kind of created a crisis, one that got the sort of attention of the new EUCOM of the U.S. military as well as the Ethiopian government, and the Ethiopians sent in forces, probably at the nudge and request of the United States, and restored what was at least a kind of semi-recognized transitional federal government that is now in the process of trying to fight and looking for support and also trying to co-opt non-Qaeda elements of the courts union to try to cobble together something that will approach the state that they lost essentially, I guess, in 91, 92. And the way I see it is that we should never lose sight of the fact that the Islamic supremacists themselves have grand ambitions and they seek to take over territory. And that I'm shout out to Meles in Ethiopia for blunting them in Somalia, and hopefully there can be some sort of better. You're right in the sense that you don't want to have like a long-term presence of the Ethiopians, and I think they are leaving at this point. So you want to have something that can fill the void. There's no movement
on their part to leave, but I mean, there's a pretty devastating UK. I guess an hour-long. They have a show. I don't know if it's Panorama. Anyway, it's Channel 4. They basically track down many of these TFG leaders as not only sort of like being kind of like expatriate warlords living in London, but that they in fact are engaged in kidnapping people for ransom and selling them back.
Well, I've met some of the. Can I say I've met some of the TFG leaders myself, and I don't know which ones this BBC
Panorama.
special got, Panorama special got. But the ones that I've talked to seemed like, they were doing the best with a very difficult situation. Listen, it's Africa. Like, there's a lot of, as I said, you're going to have to probably link up with some people that don't have the best backgrounds. But I can guarantee you it's probably better than the outfit that includes, the masterminds of the 1998 embassy bombings in Tanzania and Kenya from Al-Qaeda, like better than those guys. And those guys really are, I think, a threat primarily, to the Islamic world. Most Muslims are the frontline victims of Al-Qaeda's violence, and it is in the world's interest to defeat them.
Right. I mean, I guess there's some dispute about how many of the Islamic courts really were Al-Qaeda.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's a little.
Know.
I think. Well, this is the thing. They say the same thing about Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which is to say that yes, at the mid levels there are a lot of Iraqis who've kind of been recruited into the organization, but at the top levels, foreign leadership. I think that's they tend to have sort of a model. I think model that follows like that, where you have the foreign leader kind of imposes.
In fact, what people are sort of saying is that the remnants of the Islamic courts, now called the Alliance to Re-Liberate Somalia, that if they have a foreign puppet master, it's Eritrea.
Well, I know Eritrea sent some foreign fighters there too.
Yeah, no, they sent fighters.
Which is bizarre. What are the Eritrea? I have a soft spot for Eritrea. One of my very best friends, his sister lived in Eritrea, married an Eritrean. So I have, and I live in a neighborhood in Washington D.C., which has a lot of Ethiopians and Eritreans.
Sure.
So I really like Ethiopian culture, and I'm a big Ethiopian fan. Anyway, what I don't understand about Isaias right now is he had the whole world behind him in 99, 2000. He really did. And when he made peace in 2000, I actually was there for that ceremony in Algiers with Tony Lake and Susan Rice and Madeleine Albright. He kind of went in this autocratic, crazy direction, and now he's doing this stuff. Like, what is he doing? What are you doing?
Djibouti, actually, there was a big meeting here at the UN this week about Eritrea's most recent fight is with Djibouti. And Djibouti came running to the Security Council to say, look, I got a whole book of photos where they showed where in fact, a lot of the Eritrean troops deserted. Like, as soon as they got close to the border with Djibouti, they tried to run because it's compulsory. It's fully compulsory military service without end. So it was kind of brutal. But I think, again, Eritrea has ended up being, they're actually quite anti-U.S. as now. Maybe that's what you're going through. Oh, my God,
they really, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, they've said they all of their problems.
And you know what's weird? Can I tell you what's really kind of tricky and sensitive about that? Is that one of the National Security Agency's biggest listening stations in the world for the whole Middle East happens to be right outside of Asmara.
Right. Wow.
That's a pickle, is it not?
Isn't it? No, sure. They should see. No, it's incredible. Eritrea said they called Djibouti a servile state of a servile state, meaning Djibouti serving Ethiopia, who in turn is serving the U.S. But the thing is, Eritrea does have one thing. You may back them up on this. This whole idea of demarcating their border with Ethiopia.
Right.
They had it mediated by basically a UN body that said Eritrea is correct and should have this village, and no one has enforced it. Nobody. I actually would blame. It's unpopular to blame the U.S. for this. Okay, maybe it's just Ethiopia, but somebody needed to say to Ethiopia, "Give it up." You know what I mean? You lost. There was a case, but now this is one of the things that's driven Eritrea absolutely crazy because they're like, "What's the point? What's the point of believing in a process? Play by the rules or whatever."
But I'm just saying, I mean, let's be honest. It's not like Eritrea's. We're worried about Eritrean hegemony here.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
No, exactly. So
we're not worried. They're not a big regional power or anything.
When you're right, you're right.
For a pipsqueak power to send troops and irregular fighters to help terrorists that have been called out by, I don't know, the world's sheriff.
Right.
Come on.
Right.
It's just dumb. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I understand why they don't want too much foreign investment, and they want to. I mean, if that's what they want to do, then that's what they're going to do, right?
Sure.
If they want to try to rebuild their country in their own way, that is the call of that government. I mean, that's fine, but don't then instigate just because you can get a few licks in on Ethiopia. It's not really seeing the overall chessboard. The other thing is, Isaias has kind of been. He's turned into a farm where he's basically a dictator right now. He started off with the promise of somebody who might try to liberalize the country, and he's arrested his political prisoners and so forth. I mean, a guy a reporter named Jason Vest can talk to you about that because he actually covered that conflict in the 90s, and he can tell you about how his disappointments with Melis and Isaias from a human rights perspective.
Sure, but just more on Ethiopia. What do you make of the Ogaden region and the government's crackdown on? I guess most people there are mostly Somali, but there have been a lot of reports coming out of the government conditioning food on support for the government. Very bad stuff. I mean, do you hold up Ethiopia as which is a huge U.S. ally, as not just a paragon? I mean, are they among the better countries on human rights in Africa, according to you, or among the worst?
Wow. I'm going to do something that maybe is weird for blogging heads. I just don't have as much a command of the overall African human rights scene.
Sure.
You know what I'm saying?
No, definitely.
I can say that it doesn't meet, like, my standards.
Right.
Sure. You know, I mean, you deal with what you deal with. I mean, I don't want anyone to get the impression that I like when, you have state troops firing on university students. That's bad, okay?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Just
obviously. But, I mean, like, I can't really, I mean, like, compared to Sudan, no. I mean, Ethiopia is not as bad as Sudan. But then Sudan is, like, that's the lowest of the low. I mean, if you want to compare everybody to North Korea, then everybody looks fine, right?
But if people, not everyone, as you were saying, but if many people look to China and say they're responsible for what the government of Khartoum does, why isn't the U.S. responsible for what Melis does in, for example, Ogaden?
Well, I don't think that the U.S. quite has the relationship that China does with the Sudanese. First of all, the Sudanese state concession for their oil is now, I think, owned in majority by the Chinese national company. Okay? So that's a big difference, right? ExxonMobil doesn't have, like, a huge stake of, I don't know what Ethiopia's chief export is, right? And secondly, it was, I would say that the Christmas Day 2006 intervention was a confluence of interests as opposed to the acting on behalf of in a proxy sort of way. You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Now, in fact, one could argue, like, for example, that, like, I don't know, when Zbigniew Brzezinski allegedly told King Hussein to go tell Saddam Hussein after the hostage crisis, go invade Iran or something, at least there's one version of history that says that, though it's very complicated, that it was also a confluence of interest and so forth. But I don't think that, like, I think Melis would have maybe done that anyway. And the other thing is that, usually in a situation like that, and I know that you gotta clear it with the U.S. anyway. The U.S. shouldn't be compared to other nations in the sense that it has this huge global military presence, and huge economy and, like, all these other things. So
when you give the green light, then you have to. I mean, I think there have been. I mean, again, these are maybe.
Well, and the other thing is, I happen to agree. I mean, like, as opposed to Chinese, like, sort of apologizing and diplomatically covering for what I think are, overall sort of. I think it was overall a good thing to displace the ICU from Mogadishu. I mean, I think that overall is a good thing. If the job isn't done, there is a role now for other things that are less dramatic, okay? But, insofar as the ICU, at least as it was at the time, having their paramilitary wing or whatever run essentially by Al-Qaeda veterans, that was a bad thing for Somalia and a bad thing for the world. So in that respect,
With some people, I mean, and this is just a strategic question, but for that TFG, I think it's uncontroverted that Somalia and Ethiopia haven't gotten along for a long time, that there's some enmity between the countries. And so any government in Somalia that's viewed as having only been put back in power or propped up by the neighboring enemy is just never going to be, I don't know, accepted, seems like.
Yeah, I don't know. It's just like every time when when the lunatics invade, like, they invade too. They just don't have a, national uniform.
They don't roll over. Right.
Nobody ever, like, says, oh, well, they're never going to be... I mean, like, I don't think it's... at this point, I suppose Hezbollah in Lebanon is sort of legitimate. You know what I'm saying? Like, I guess because they've been there for so long. Mm-hmm. But when they first came, they had to kill a lot of people, and they had to impose rule by, they had to basically impose a local regime of fear in order to get the allegiance of the population. Right. And we find that, that was the case at least in Anbar in Iraq. Mm-hmm. That was the case in large swaths of southern Iraq now. We now find with regards to the local control of elements of the Mahdi army. Mm-hmm. So, sometimes, I just like, lots of people, Somalia sadly has had this sort of war-torn history, but, and I would also, like, go back and agree with you that Ethiopian troops, I think, are leaving. Am I right about that?
Everyone's been talking about it, and the agreement they struck in Djibouti is that, and it's by a sort of a moderate faction of the Islamic courts. Yes, you heard it. The moderate Islamic courts went to Djibouti and cut a deal with the TFG under which UN peacekeepers would go in if and when Ethiopians leave. No timetable. First
Okay,
of all,
well,
I'm
let's
not
get
at
a
all-
timetable. I mean, I guess I'm for that. That's the one that. But my understanding is that it was going that way. But you're right.
There's no
yet.
timetable. And
Right, but let's do that. And I think that the U.S., it's a delicate balance, right? I mean, first of all, are there any UN peacekeepers to Blue Helmets to send at this point?
There really aren't. That's why it's also totally unrealistic. Nobody's going to contribute, frankly, at least under the current situation, because these guys really do get shot at. I mean, it's
Right, the last time the UN went to Somalia was a nasty.
Yeah, I know. It's not.
Right.
But actually, on the U.S. front, do you remember this story during? I think it was just after the Ethiopian
Yes.
conquest of Mogadishu. There was this story that the U.S. had given the green light for North Korea to ship tank parts to Ethiopia for this endeavor.
Now that doesn't surprise me. The UN gave, wonderful.
Right, but it was a great story because it was so. In fact, a lot of the kind of like, people were like, well, what hypocrisy? You know what I mean? Because there's armed sanctions and North Korea, but it was sort of like in this one case,
Yes.
it's worth it. Let's hold our
This is
nose.
great, by the way, the All Africa edition of Blogging Heads.
Okay, no, let's move on. We can talk about Korea.
Zimbabwe.
Okay, good. All right.
Do you want to just do a brief thing on Zimbabwe? Okay. By the way, just for your viewers,
Sure.
Remember all the promise? I mean, I was a young lad in 1979, but Stevie Wonder and Bob Marley did songs about Mugabe.
Right.
Remember?
Yeah, sure.
So that's just anyway.
Well,
what
I
a
thought you were gonna go
long
Haile
way we've
Selassie,
come. What a
since we're-
disappointment Mugabe has been.
Since we're talking Ethiopia, you were going to go back to Haile Selassie and the real Bob Marley. There's
Yeah, the
a
real
whole bunch
Haile-
of
right.
was about that. You know?
Exactly. Right. And speaking of now to bring full circle, right? Mengistu
Sure.
is sheltered in Harare by Robert Mugabe.
Right. But how about Hissanin Habre, the alleged war criminal of Chad, now in Senegal? Any view?
Yeah, what about that? That's amazing because I didn't even know about that. That's great.
He is. They're going to set up their own trial in Senegal to try him, rather than extradite him. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But no, go ahead. I know that you've written on Zimbabwe this week, so I'm turning over.
Yeah, no, anyway, we had an editorial at the New York Sun, which I would urge our
you should send in the link.
viewers to read, and we'll send a link. And we basically we said Ban Ki-moon should invite Tsvangirai, who won the March 29th election. I think we all agree, right?
Did he get less than 50%, according to you? Not to be a stickler, but...
Well, they never counted the votes. I mean, I don't know. They stopped the counting, right? He was ahead. Everybody... the UK and the US recognized him as the winner.
The numbers I heard is that he got, his party got 47 and Mugabe got 43, but under the Zimbabwean constitution, this triggers a runoff. This is the argument they're making here.
They stopped the counting. Okay. That's the key thing you got to know.
Did Al Gore win in 2000?
What?
Did Al Gore win? Did he get more votes in 2000?
Oh, you're trying to get me.
Oh,
right here?
No.
You're trying to get me on that one.
No. I actually asked the U.S. ambassador her, and you said it's a ludicrous comparison. I only did it. I don't believe. I mean, that's Zimbabwe's argument.
Did you ask Zalmay Khalilzad?
I asked Alejandro Wolf. He's the deputy. Yeah, Khalilzad wouldn't deign to. He would just scoff at that. He
wouldn't deign to meet with Matt Lee.
Yeah.
By the way, there's another excellent reporter at the State Department named Matt Lee. You guys should get together.
I've heard of him. That's actually why I put Russell in my name. I don't want to steal his thunder. He's the man. He's been a foreign correspondent. He's been all over.
I was in North Korea with him with Madeline Albright. He's fantastic.
Yeah. No.
Matthew Lee for the Associated Press.
Yep.
Is a rock star.
Yeah. No. He's incredible.
And he's been shot at by the Khmer Rouge.
Well, that's.
He's been shot by the Khmer Rouge actually.
Wow.
Anyway, he's a great guy. I'm a big Matthew Lee fan.
All right,
and I'm a fan of yours now.
I'll take the runoff.
I'm a fan of yours too now after doing this. Anyway, I just feel like now would be the time to recognize Tsvangirai after everything that Mugabe's thugs have done, from murder to torture to detain everything. Okay, it's just It's like now's the time for the free world, for the best of our values, to sort of stand up and say, let's come up with a plan of transition for Zimbabwe. I mean, he made the runoff election basically impossible. He doesn't even. I mean, it looks like even the South Africans might be moving away from him, with Mandela finally saying, albeit far too little in my opinion, but even Mandela, who's been silent on this, has said there was a failure in leadership in Zimbabwe. Even the ANC, the party of Thabo Mbeki, obviously, Mbeki himself is not saying these things, but they came out with a very, very harsh statement, I believe, on Wednesday. We're starting to see right now, and it would be nice to see the UN lead the way. Why can't the UN say, listen, we want to hear what Tsvangirai... Listen, it's not unprecedented. They invited Arafat in the 70s when he was involved with Black September. Why not Tsvangirai?
Right, no, I mean, I first, one thing, as you were saying that, it made me think of is Morgan Tsvangirai the new Aung San Suu Kyi? You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, right. Give him a Nobel Prize.
Right,
exactly.
On that way, but also like how is so? Did the world community say Aung San Suu Kyi is the leader of Myanmar, and what? You know what I mean? I don't know why.
I don't know that it was. Well, I think it's pretty clear. Well, because this is happening around an election like this. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Now, of course, the UN won't do that because the UN's got plenty of member states that do not want to create any kind of standard where there's like any sort of serious diplomatic penalty or censure for someone who steals an election. Because, hey, there's a lot of election thieves right now who have envoys at Turtle Bay.
But,
right?
But there are a lot of countries in the world that are not democracies at all. But the U.S. does business with many of them. Yeah,
they do business with any of them, but Zimbabwe is a country that has a court system and did have elections. And when you want to go backwards,
I'm not a defender. I mean, don't get me wrong.
I know you're not. I'm just saying.
But I was thinking of it this morning. I was sort of like, in the reality, it's kind of like it's interesting that there seems to be a kind of unanimity in the world to say like, there no government will be legitimate in Zimbabwe unless it was the choice of the Zimbabwean people. And then you think of many governments on earth that have never even put themselves to a vote or any kind of a credible vote. And so I mean, maybe they're illegitimate too. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, I do think that they're somewhat illegitimate, and I'm in favor of, having tiered international citizenship. Or no, I mean, let me be honest. Okay, that's not going to happen. I know that's not going to happen. Mm-hmm. I would love to have like a, kind of like crappy facilities for the Zimbabwean, Iranian, North Korean, Burmese ambassadors and so forth, and tell them that they can't serve on any meaningful committees, and on and on and on. But realistically, that's why I like the League of Democracies or the Concert of Democracies or whatever, which is that there should be some sort of international fora and institution that helps people who want to democratize unfree and repressive states. And in this era that we live in, where you've got rogue proliferation of nuclear weapon and nuclear material, not to mention germs and terrorism and all these things that are kind of transnational threats that affect all of us, not to mention cyber threats as well as we become more connected on the internet. The contents and how a government treats its people becomes far more relevant to all of us. From a national security perspective. And we need to figure out with an intelligent strategy that manages to transition from dictatorship to democracy without, obviously, invading countries, or for that matter, doing it in a way that looks like it's just cover or window dressing for, kind of expanding, the dominion of like a great power like the United States or the Europeans or something like that.
Right. No. One thing. I mean, I was going to joke and say like, what isn't like there's NATO, there's the G8. I mean, there's a lot of groupings. I have a defense of the UN, believe it or not, that I'll do in a second. But I want on this or maybe I'll do not to be. I mean, to be pro Tsvangirai is a no-brainer, right?
Right.
It seems like
right.
It seems like what Mugabe,
cancer.
But his pitch, domestically, and there are some, paid or not, some thugs with whom it resonates, and maybe they're just people that want to steal people's land. But his whole thing is that Tsvangirai has thrown his lot with Gordon Brown, Tony Blair. I mean, I guess what I'm saying is it would be like the UN. I think it would be great if he spoke at the GA. I think like if Gordon Brown came out and said, "We recognize you as the real leader of Zimbabwe," I don't even think it would help him, Tsvangirai.
Yeah, no. If it was just Gordon Brown, no. Right. But that's why the UN. See, that's the thing is that people don't. Can I give you the neoconservative?
Go ahead. I've been trying to tease it out of you, but if
I've been neocon the whole time, man.
Go ahead.
I'm keeping it real.
All right.
Anyway. Let me give you the two reasons why you shouldn't kick the United Nations out of New York. As much as they madden me, and believe me, it's maddening, the United Nations. One, you really do need an institution. You really need an institution like the United Nations that's not America, that can at least at times try to resolve conflicts, monitor elections, and basically like there's certain kind of things that we need to do, and for like everybody agrees, like I don't know, modern agriculture, right?
Shooting down an asteroid. There's an asteroid coming toward the U.S.
Right, exactly. Whatever, that kind of thing. And you need them to do because the U.S. it's the most powerful nation in a lot of ways, but it's also still a nation, right? And the UN, you can avoid that. So if you can have the UN work towards, generally making the world more democratic and liberal and prosperous and, ending all those things, it's useful to have that from just the perspective that it's very different if you have a sort of UN-mediated process as opposed to an American-mediated process, right?
Sure.
From just a pure politics perspective. The other reason, and this is kind of going to sound a little Machiavellian, but this is real talk, Matt.
Sure,
go ahead. I'm giving you some real talk
right here.
That's
what we're looking for.
Yeah. The United Nations headquarters in New York City is an amazing intelligence asset for the United States. Period. Finish. The end. So, we would be losing a great insight into the, at least, sort of diplomatic maneuverings and correspondence of,
Are you saying it's all broke here?
States.
Are you saying that the carnivore program is at work in Turtle Bay?
You be the judge.
Right.
All I'm saying is that I think some mail is being read.
Sure.
How about that?
No. I mean, you remember.
So those are the two kind of American nationalist reasons for not kicking them out of the United Nations. As frustrating as that institution is when they get together in their little human rights grouping and say all this terrible stuff about Israel and appoint Richard Falk, the 9/11 truther, and and the Durban stuff. I mean, there's a whole lot of things I don't like about the UN, and it's frustrating. Sometimes in my supposed weaker moments, I think that we should send our next ambassador should be some sort of clown or something like that. But I'm kidding.
Right.
Those are there are sound reasons for the UN.
There was just one thing. I mean, there was this story that the Brits were bugging Kofi Annan. Do you remember that one? So they were somehow able on their own to hook up a microphone on the 38th floor of the UN.
Yeah. Well, no, listen, I don't know all the details. I'm just telling you. And the other thing is that all that signal intelligence is shared by all of the English-speaking nations except for one of them that's not participating in it.
Right.
It's either New Zealand or New Guinea. I forget which one.
But
there's a treaty. They share all that stuff. So
Here's a second-hand defense of the UN. But there was an event here yesterday about commemorating the Holocaust, genocide, never again, and they had. Yeah. The room was packed. It was like an auditorium here, and in the UN has a special advisor for the responsibility to protect, and there was a guy from Rwanda. It was a UN event. They were all. I showed up and asked, "What about the UN's role in Srebrenica?" and everybody went crazy. But there was a question asked by a guy from.
Did you ask that?
I did ask that. Yes, and.
That's excellent.
No, I thought that. I don't know if that's I have no idea what the politics of it are. It's just, to me, it's hypocrisy is the beat. The beat is you're saying these grand things. Not hypocrisy, just how do you answer? It's not just that what the UN did in Srebrenica. It's that there's now a case in the Dutch courts trying to hold the UN accountable. And the UN
what is it with these European courts think that the entire world is their business?
Well, you know what it is? Because the case is mostly against the Dutch military. The peacekeepers in Srebrenica were Dutch from the Netherlands. And they... After herding people together, refused to defend them. Now, what they claim is that they were outgunned. There was 400 of them and 10,000 Serbs. But
anyway, I know that it was a Dutch peacekeeper. I'm just saying, they always they're going to try. They always hey, they might try Rumsfeld and stuff.
Right.
I'm come on, enough already.
But but the U.S. we have the Alien Torts Claims Act, right?
I know, and the U.S. has victims of terrorism against the Iranians. I'm just for all these domestic courts. It's it's enough already.
Right,
you know what I mean?
But in this case,
if we have a problem, listen, Americans have died because of Iranian terrorism. Right. That's something that you deal with in the realm of statecraft, but not your domestic judicial system.
Well, no, in this one, I think that the UN has not only saying that it's immune from a lawsuit. It didn't even show up in the case. This is the one thing I tried to get them to say. It's did you make a filing to say you're immune? And they said, well, no, we don't even have to. We're always immune. And then but then,
it's its own little world. No, the UN, there's a post office. It's got its own, It's got its own everything.
No, it's incredible. But I think, I think that the real, and I don't know what the solution here is, but that type of immunity breeds contempt. You know what I mean? If you don't have to answer for what you do, inevitably what you do becomes more and more unaccountable than anything. And so,
you know what? You got to write a book, man. Okay. You got to write a book on the UN. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Just keeping it real.
Sure. But here was, I think a guy from the audience said, what he's frustrated with about the UN is why isn't Ahmadinejad being charged with genocide for having, he said, come to the UN and said the state of Israel should stop existing. And the UN offered a defense. This guy called Ed Luck, he's the advisor on responsibility to protect. First he pointed out that the statement wasn't made at the UN, and the audience kind of hissed. And
it wasn't
booed.
made at the UN?
Yeah, I don't know what that was. But then he made a point.
Right.
He said you want to have a place where if Israel and Iran were to talk, they could do it, here in the quiet halls of the UN. And I don't know if it really convinced, the people in the audience weren't that convinced by that. I don't know if you are. But that was his...
My feeling is that, like, listen, Ahmadinejad is a reptile, and he disgusts me. Mm-hmm. So, and he's not a legitimate president, and I have a lot of problems with a whole kind of class of the pundocracy that tries to explain that he doesn't really mean what he says fairly explicitly. And by the way, what also the supreme leader of Iran says explicitly, and that whole regime seems hell-bent on doing by both their actions and rhetoric. Mm-hmm. So, but at the same time, that's the UN. The Khrushchev said he would bury the United States. You know what I'm saying? He said, I think he did say that at the UN, did he not?
He did.
Do I think that, there could be a case made that the Iranian president is inciting genocide or threatening genocide? Mm-hmm. Listen, that becomes a very serious question, by the way, Matt, as soon as they test a nuclear device. Mm-hmm. If they go nuclear and publicly, okay, and then they continue to say that Israel's a microbe that they want to wipe from the pages of history, then that becomes a very serious issue, because at that point they may have the means to actually do it. And that becomes and then I know that Israel does not want to see the point where, the threats are coupled with maybe the capability. Even if even if people can predict and say at the end of the day they wouldn't launch a first strike, or who knows, by the way. Right. I'm not sanguine about that, and I sort of just admit the limits of my knowledge on this. But
incitement to genocide, can you see such a case being brought?
I don't, yes. Court? But the problem with Iran, the best solution for Iran is to end the experiment in this Khomeinist revolution and have what Iranian members of the Majlis wanted and said they wanted, which is ultimately, a referendum on the powers of the supreme leader and a referendum on the council and jurisprudence, and to restore their country, which has something of a democratic tradition in Iran, to its real independence. Effectively, they're being occupied right now by clerical lunatics. And I think that ultimately, if you really want the real Iran policy, it's got to happen. You figure out a clever way that you can provide aid and support and diplomatic bolstering of, the population in Iran that is now discouraged, some of whom are in jail, beaten down, living in fear. And you need to sort of change that dynamic so you can have the kind of velvet revolution that was successful against Milosevic, ultimately successful against Shevardnadze, and ultimately successful against in Ukraine. And I'm forgetting whoever they Lukashenko.
Right.
Am I right?
Yeah.
So there you go.
Well, I'm going to let you. That's going to have to be. We're going to have to wait for our next episode together to plot that one.
Have I replaced Mark Leon Goldberg? No, I'm just
no.
Replace Mark Leon Goldberg. Who could replace Mark Leon Goldberg?
Right.
This was really fun, Matthew Lee. You are very interesting and a very good reporter. I learned a lot in this conversation.
No, I really that's the thing I like. It's funny. You can the facts will never get to you, and especially on things like this Eritrea Djibouti. Nobody really cared about it. So I asked a few questions. Next thing I know, I got pictures of the speedboats from the Djiboutian embassy, and I wrote something. I got angry emails from Eritrea. It's there's so many things around the world that are sort of under the radar.
I need your sources. Yeah, no, that's good. I got good sources, but you got some good. That's good.
Yeah, no,
stuff,
it's really open whatever. Okay, so Eli, thanks a lot. And
thank you, Matthew Lee.
Send those links in, and we'll take it from there.
Very good.
Okay. Bye-bye.